Welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Articulate Talk series, English Critical and Creative Responses Under Pressure. We're very, very excited and thankful to have Dr. Meg Brayshaw and Dr. Meera Atkinson joining us today to present this Articulate. And welcome to everyone this evening. We've had a huge response to this webinar, so we're really excited to be able to host it. Before I begin, I would just like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming to you from today. I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I recognise and pay respects to elders and communities past, present and emerging, and those elders on the lands of the University of Sydney and the University of Sydney campuses. For thousands of years, they have shared and exchanged knowledges across innumerable generations for the benefit of all. So the program for this evening and what Meera and Meg will take you through shortly. So part one is critical responses, and that's with Dr. Meg Brayshaw. And Meg will look at a toolkit for comprehending unseen texts and how to do it quickly. Part two is creative responses with Dr. Meera Atkinson. And some of the things that Meera will cover is preparing for exams, so being able to read as a writer, toolkit for discursive writing, toolkit for imaginative writing, and general tips for writing under pressure. So all really great things to have in your toolkit and prepare you for your upcoming trials and HSC exams. We'll do a little bit of a Q&A at the end with Meera and Meg. So any questions that you have, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A section and they'll be answered at the end for you. And then we have an evaluation we'd love for you to fill in to let us know your thoughts about tonight and any other things that you'd like to see through our Articulate series. And just a reminder to everyone that you would have received either yesterday or today a stimulus booklet and some links to some of the texts that are going to be Meera and Meg are going to go through this afternoon. So please have that handy. And Joyce is also going to put that in the chat for you as well, so you can access it through the chat if you don't have it in front of you. Yeah, I've probably already been through this, but a little bit of housekeeping. So add your questions into the Q&A function. This session is going to be recorded and it will be sent to you after today as well. So if you have anyone who isn't here who wanted to be here, feel free to send it through to them as well. And if you have any questions after today, please feel free to email us at fast.partnerships@sydney.edu.au. And I would love to now hand over to Dr. Meg Brayshaw and Dr. Meera Atkinson, who are going to take you through our webinar for this evening. And I'll start with you, Meg. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So this evening, I'll be taking you through the unseen texts part of your HSC exam for the common module, Texts and Human Experiences. It can be extremely daunting having to read and respond critically to texts you've never read before in the high pressure environment of an exam. As an academic, I might spend months deciding what I think about a particular text, and you folks have to do it in minutes, which I can remember from my HSC is rather terrifying. But there are some toolkits you can use to comprehend unseen text quickly and write good critical responses, even when you're not 100% sure about every aspect or the overall grand meaning of a text. So that's what I'm going to talk you through today. So in the exam, you're most likely to get a combination of prose fiction, non-fiction, which can include feature articles, memoir, essays, etc., poetry and visual text. Today, I'm going to concentrate on the three written forms. So all texts are produced from three elements. The first is the most obvious, the content. What's the text about? What's it trying to tell us? Is it trying to convey an argument, an emotion, a sense of place or character, or a combination of these? We can also think about how a text makes us feel as part of its content. So you should try to get a rough sense of the text content in your 10 minutes reading time. But don't worry if you're not totally clear on everything it's trying to say. You can still answer the question well. All writers produce their content through style and form. Style involves the language choices the writer has made, from big structural decisions like what voice or tense they'll write in, to the use of metaphors and other language techniques. Form is about how the text is presented on the page, how it has been constructed out of sentences and paragraphs, and whether it belongs to a particular literary genre or mode, like, for example, a sonnet. Style and form are the building blocks of texts. The exam questions will ask you to discuss how a writer is producing content. Often the question will name an aspect of content they want you to focus on, like a particular human experience, from style and form. So here's a couple of mind maps showing some basic elements of style and form. I'm sure you're all familiar with most of these, but it's important to have them in the back of your mind as you enter the exam, so you can be looking for them as you are reading the texts. So I know that students are sometimes less likely to look at form carefully, but it's really important, just as important as style. In poetry, you might know to look at line lengths and the number of lines in stanzas, but in prose and nonfiction, you can also look at how the writer has varied sentence lengths and used blank space. You can also look at formal techniques like the use of frame narratives, a story within a story, or prolepsis, when a text looks into or makes a prediction about the future, or analepsis, better known as flashback. Language, over in the style map, is a huge category. The possibility when it comes to using language creatively are almost endless. But here's a map of some of the most common elements of language to look for. Again, I'm sure you're all familiar with the elements I've identified here. As simple as it seems, the first thing to do is to look for grouped or repeated words, phrases, or ideas, especially if you're not sure about a text content, because they can give you an insight into a writer's purpose or approach. Metaphors are often the engine of prose and poetry. When you notice a metaphor, though, think carefully about how it has been constructed and why. To take a common example that's often used to teach young students what a metaphor is, the moon was a silver dollar. But why is the writer using currency to talk about the moon? Are they saying something about commodification or value? If they had said the moon is a fish's eye, that would have still been talking about the moon via a metaphor, but it would have vastly different connotations, different meaning. We need to think all the way to the end of a metaphor, so to speak. The main thing to know is that being able to name specific techniques like alliteration, onomatopoeia, etc., is less important than being able to point to elements of the text that you think are crucial to the text meaning and being able to explain why. Whenever you notice an element of style or form, you need to immediately ask yourself the toddler's favorite question, but why? Why has the writer chosen that element of style and form as the best way to convey their ideas? So let's look at an example question to explain this a little further. So let's imagine an unseen text in an exam, perhaps a nonfiction piece. The question is asking you how to explain how the writer conveys a feeling of uncertainty in this text. So I've noticed that there's some repetition in the text. I write an answer. The use of repetition emphasizes the writer's feelings of uncertainty. This isn't really a good answer. You've identified the technique, sure, but it's not enough to say that the use of it emphasizes the writer's uncertainty. Lots of techniques could be used to create emphasis, but the writer chose repetition. Why? So a good answer, and it's longer, but it kind of has to be, tells us what has been repeated and gives us a clear reason for that repetition. The writer frequently repeats the words maybe and perhaps, and often uses em dashes instead of full stops. This combination conveys a sense of uncertainty. The speaker is so uncertain that they repeat the same qualifying adverbs and are unable to complete a sentence or thought before beginning a new one. This answer notices another element of repetition to do with punctuation. So always try to look for the cumulative effect of multiple techniques, how they work together to create meaning. And it gives us a clear explanation of the significance of these techniques. It answers the but why question. So I'm going to run through some example text with you now, and hopefully you've all got access to that PDF that Joyce has just put into the chat. It has all the text I'm talking about today, plus a few extras, including visual text and some sample questions in case anybody wants extra practice. So our first text is an extract from Gail Jones's 2011 novel, 5 Bells. You can see here on the slide a list of elements of style and form that are most important to prose fiction. I'm going to run through how some of these elements are working in the text. So let's look at that first sentence. It tells us so much. We know we have a close or slanted third-person point of view, where the narrator seems to be perched on the character's shoulder, seeing what they see, but also seeing into their thoughts. The term circular key, followed by the colon, tells us that this piece of writing is probably going to be about a place. And the italicization tells us that this is not an everyday experience, but something new for the character. Noticing some grouped words or ideas, we get a lot of images of light and sight, which again convey that the character is experiencing Sydney for the first time and that it's reorientating her perspective on the place she has heard about but never visited before. We can also notice some metaphors. There's the simple but evocative trampoline heart, which suggests that in this place, the character is feeling a childlike joy, the way you might feel bouncing on a trampoline. Later, when the character sees the harbour bridge, Jones contrasts a cliche, coat hanger, with a more unusual metaphor, frozen hard labour, to indicate that the character is forming her own opinions of this famous landmark. Jones uses techniques like alliteration and onomatopoeia to create a vibrant, sensuous scene through language. Moving on to form, always note the title of a piece and see if you can glean any meaning from it. Here, the title, It Felt 5 Bells, is a homage to a very famous poem by Kenneth Slessor. But even if you don't know the reference, you might think about the connotation of bells, musical instruments that mark time and special occasions of both joy and grief. And I think that has resonance with the scene that we've read here. It's somewhat unusual to have a line break where a whole line is skipped between paragraphs in prose texts. So here, Jones employs one relatively early. It follows the final words, new world, of the first paragraph. So the line break contributes through form to the sense of a passage into a new world. It visually creates a definitive point of transition on the page. We can also notice sentence lengths. It's important to look out for very long and very short sentences in prose fiction, anything that varies from the norm. So in this piece, as our character makes her way out of Circular Quay Station, from the platform, down the escalator, through the turnstiles, carried outside by the crowd, Jones uses a long sentence separated by commas to suggest on the page the process of moving slowly out of the station. Let's turn now to a non-fiction text. In the exam, you might have a non-fiction text labelled just as non-fiction, or as memoir, as this text is, or say a feature article. Those genre labels can help you decide what the author's purpose might be. A text labelled non-fiction probably wants to educate, a memoir is about the self, and a feature article usually responds to a contemporary issue or socio-cultural phenomenon in a way that is meant to be both educational and understanding. The key thing, though, is to look at each piece's element of style and form. Non-fiction writers draw from the same toolkit as fiction writers, so you'll notice some crossover in those two modes. So this text is drawn from the writer Paul Auster's memoir called Report from the Interior. Let's break it down. So the first thing we notice here is that despite being a memoir, this piece of writing uses second person, you. That's a fairly odd choice for a piece of writing about the self. And odd choices are always the things you want to look at because they carry a lot of meaning. Auster is talking about his childhood self, so perhaps he uses you here to indicate how distant that self feels from him in adulthood. When we discussed Jones's 5 Bells, I pointed to a contrast between a cliche and an unusual metaphor. Another aspect of metaphor you can consider is the type and amount of metaphors. Here we have a number of simple metaphors, like the clock was a human face. These simple metaphors, one after another, create a sense of the boy's rich imaginative life. He sees the whole world in metaphor. Intertextuality, when a text draws obviously or implicitly from another text, is something you can look for in all types of writing. If you spot a reference you recognize, that's great. See if you can figure out why the writer has evoked this text. Here, Auster integrates nursery rhymes. So the young boy finds these ideas of the cow jumping over the moon and the dish running away with the spoon credible, which contributes to the text sense of imaginative wonder. In the final paragraph of the extract, we notice that Oster has repeated variations of the word remember a number of times. We might think here that this repetition indicates Oster's attempt to move closer to that distant self through memory. The repetition signals that this isn't an easy thing to do. Finally, now that we've read the piece, let's go back. We can reflect a little more on that title, Report from the Interior. It's interesting that Oster employs the word report, often associated with factual scientific writings, in the title of his memoir. This suggests that he is conducting an almost scientific study on his interior life, on his childhood self. So before I get into talking about poetry, I wanted to share with you this quotation from the great American poet Louise Gluck, who says that poetry survives because it haunts, and it haunts because it is simultaneously utterly clear and deeply mysterious, because it cannot be entirely accounted for, it cannot be exhausted. I share this with you because I think sometimes we can find poetry pretty daunting. And I want to remind you that it's okay if you don't get a poem in its entirety the first time you read it. Some poems just aren't meant to be got. However, if you're confronted in the exam with a poem that doesn't immediately seem clear to you, there's still plenty of elements of style and form you can look for, which might be enough to give you some sense of what the poet is trying to do. Here we have an extract from a long poem by Natalie Harkin and Leanne Bedasomasake Simpson called We're the Moon. On the right, as usual, I have a list of common elements of poetic style and form. Now, this is a beautiful poem, but its meaning might seem a bit opaque at first. So we're going to look at what we can notice upon a first reading. First, we notice that the poem is voiced kind of unusually. It employs a mix of first, plural first, and second person. We know that this poem has been written collaboratively, which explains the plural voice, but it's interesting that it switches back and forth between these perspectives, which might mean that the poets are experimenting with varying the distance between the poem, the poets, and the reader. So we could guess maybe this poem is about connection or disconnection. Looking at grouped ideas or words, we'll notice a theme emerging here in words such as shadows, glitch, weight of worry, spin out, fight, flight, tremor, trepidation, and fatigue. These words taken together might suggest uncertainty and anxiety. Turning to the imagery, it's not surprising that a poem called We Are the Moon has a lot of celestial imagery, and particularly imagery of light and darkness. I've noticed here the rhyming of light and night. The rhyme brings these opposite states together. Could this indicate for the speakers that time or space are collapsing? With poems, of course, we always look at how the text is laid out on the page. Here we immediately notice that the poem is making use of non-standard spaces in the middle of lines. These spaces are somewhat surprising. They seem to happen almost randomly. They're not a standard size. If we couple this with the other evidence we found, we might think that the spaces represent distance between the different speaking perspectives, we, I, you. This doesn't look like a standard poem, not like, for instance, a sonnet. A poem like Jill Jones's Marrickville sonnet, that I won't talk about, but you can find in your stimulus booklet, looks very different on the page to We Are the Moon, because it is using the standard 14-line sonnet structure. Form is so important to poetry. There's a lot more that I could say, but in the interest of time, let's move on to answering a sample question. So here's a question about our first text, 5 Bells. Explain how Gail Jones uses language to convey the experience of encountering a new place for the first time. So here's our evidence, all the elements of style and form we've identified. The key is to pick out the group of elements that you think will best allow you to answer the question. And again, it's especially good if you can think about the cumulative effects of those elements, how they are working together to make meaning. So in an answer that I prepared earlier, to illustrate the persona's surprise and joy at encountering Sydney for the first time, Jones uses phrases that suggest new vision, including clear sky and shock of sudden light, and the metaphor of trampoline heart, which indicates the persona's childlike enthusiasm for the new place. The use of a line break after the opening paragraph reinforces through form the sense that the character is entering a thoroughly new and unfamiliar space. Jones contrasts a cliche, coat hanger, with an unusual metaphor, the span of frozen hard labour, to illustrate the persona's surprise at seeing the Harbour Bridge for the first time and the forming of her own unique impressions of this famous landmark. So I've included 4 techniques in my answer. I've used the verbs illustrate, reinforces, and indicate to make it clear that I'm supplying answers to the crucial but why question. Jones is using these techniques to illustrate, indicate, and reinforce her meaning. I haven't just listed a bunch of techniques in my answer. I've made sure to clearly explain how each technique contributes to my answer to the question. And finally, I've chosen elements of style and form to provide a holistic analysis of the text. So that's it from me. I hope this was helpful. And if you feel like answering some questions on your own, there's plenty in the stimulus booklet that I provided.
Thanks so much, Meg. That's fantastic. I will now hand over to Dr. Meera Atkinson, who's going to go through the creative responses. Thanks, Meera.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. So I am going to give you a very warm welcome to part 2, creative responses. So I'm just taking over the driving seat here. Okay, we're going to start by looking at how you can prepare for exams by reading as a writer, and then we'll look at some tips for discursive writing, for imaginative writing, and writing under pressure. We're splitting our presentation into 2 parts to help you prepare for the specific critical and creative tasks in the HSC exam. But in reality, these 2 practices are closely related and overlap. Reading is a creative act, and creative writing requires keen critical skills. So you can prepare by analysing the kinds of texts you find the most challenging to write. Exams are stressful, but creative writing requires a degree of play. So the more prepared you are, the more you'll be able to relax in the moment and get into the creative flow. I recommend blocking out time each week leading up to the exams to practice reading as a writer, which will help you gain an understanding of how skilled writers craft texts. We'll do this together in a minute. So, what is this reading as a writer homework I'm suggesting? I want you to select a minimum of 3 discursive texts and a minimum of 3 imaginative texts. Make sure you choose texts with a range of qualities that foreground different creative strategies and read them very, very closely. Then go through again, identifying the craft choices and effects in each text. And as you do that, take notes and consider your responses, including your bodily and emotional responses to the various craft strategies, and assess which of those are working to what degree. Then Google writing prompts and/or writing exercise, come up with a range of them. Doesn't matter what you think of them, just the point here is to practice responding to prompts that are thrown at you. Set a timer for 30 to 40 minutes and write, drawing on some of the strategies you identified. Now, I'm focusing on discursive and imaginative texts today because I'm told students are generally more confident about persuasive writing as a result of getting plenty of practice with analytic essays and rhetoric. The texts I've selected are longer and more sophisticated than you'll be able to produce in the time you have, and they're also written by very experienced writers. I've chosen examples from Overland Literary Journal because it publishes many young Australian writers, and all the texts I'm referencing are available free online. So let's get into it. The first example is a long essay by Elias Gregg. I won't have time to address everything highlighted on the slides, but I'll give focus to some key aspects of the texts. You can study the slides more closely on your own, as they'll be available to you after the talk. I expect you're familiar with the literary technique terms I note on the slide, but if there's anything you're unsure of, just look it up. Take a note as we go through or later, and look each one up that you're not quite sure of or that you want more information on. I'll have to move through the slides at a pace, but a recording will be made available so you can review again later if you miss something. Hopefully you've already read the 2 works I'm concentrating on, as the links were distributed ahead of the talk. But in case you haven't, the opening 2 paragraphs set the scene, depicting the narrator and their partner feeling out of place in an alien suburb and charting their early impressions. When reading as a writer, you're not looking at a text in critique interpretive mode, so much as seeking to identify the craft choices and effects of those choices to better understand how a writer has constructed a text. So you're really looking at the building blocks and trying to identify all the different elements that make a text and that make it really effective. So the first choices you generally encounter are what narrative voice the writer has chosen and what tense they're casting the narrative in. This essay is written in the first person, which naturally means the story is told from the narrator's point of view. It's written in past tense, so we understand the narrator is recounting their past experiences. Discursive writing is usually in first person, but it can also be in third person. The effect of first person is it creates a sense of intimacy and highlights identity. Class and sensibility are defining aspects of identity as this narrator views himself as an outsider in Mossman. The essay begins with an event, a change of location. Discursive writing can also begin with a relevant quote or anecdote that marks out the terrain to be explored. The text is quickly established as having a factual foundation. Mossman is a wealthy suburb, but it still uses figurative, descriptive language, metaphor, simile, and other literary devices. Toward the end of the second paragraph, a new angle is introduced, a conflict with a neighbour that seems fairly minor, but that soon evolves in surprising ways. So let's move on to the second excerpt. Just a quick note about the asterisks that you might see on some of these slides. It indicates that the paragraphs are not continuous, that I've skipped forward in the essay to show you some key developments. Paragraph 5 builds on the narrator's perception of the neighbourhood's anxious atmosphere. He feels as if he's under scrutiny and in turn begins a surveillance of the late night environment. In this excerpt, you can see a conversational tone at work that's common to discursive writing, as well as sensory detail and simile, and he depicts a scene at a wharf on a moonless night where he has an experience that leads to his conception of the whale ghosts in the harbour and the whale ghost motif. There's an anecdote, more simile, and some alliteration. The essay then continues charting the couple's experiences in the suburb and the narrator's fascination with it against the background of escalating conflict with the neighbours. Paragraph 26 explicitly names and confirms the whales as a thematic metaphor. And at this point, the narrative has covered a lot of ground, but the strands are coming together. It's clear the different avenues the writer has explored are all connected. In paragraph 28, the whale ghosts turn out to be an effect of capitalism, a harbour phenomenon caused by luxury boats. And finally, the essay concludes with a reflective resolution, common in discursive writing. The reader is left with a stirring evocation of a certain kind of Sydney suburb reality and history. So here are some tips for discursive writing. I don't have time to dig deeper into all these, although there's more I could say on each of them. They're pretty self-explanatory. I'll let you review them in your own time. In short, don't overreach, choose an achievable idea given the constraints, aim for some nuance, and remember, discursive literary writing is not an op-ed or an academic argument. Employ some of the literary devices we're identifying in these slides and leave 5 minutes for a quick edit and polish. This is obviously more productive and possible if you're working on a computer than if you're writing by hand. And here are some questions to help guide your reading as a writer practice, and also links to the Greek essay and some other discursive texts that you might want to explore. So let's get into the imaginative. Late Night Shopping by Jumana Abdu is a story about a young Australian Muslim woman who wears hijab and experiences routine racism. The narrative involves her relationship with her workmate Sonia and her colleague crush Bilal. This is also narrated in first person, but could have worked in third. Omniscient would be okay, but free indirect discourse would be better because the narrating character's perspective is important in this story. And free indirect discourse, otherwise known as free indirect style, is a way of infusing a third-person narration with the feelings, attitudes, or voice of a character. So consider the different effects of one versus another, and particularly in relation to your theme or topic. The opening sentence is a line of dialogue. She had like a very ethnic way of walking. It drops the reader into the middle of a scene in a store. A customer is complaining to a sales assistant about the conduct of another staff member. A tense conversation is taking place, but there's humour in the scene too. Dialogue, narrator commentary, and description work to communicate characters and introduce the theme of race and everyday racism. Now, there's a lot going on in terms of craft in this short and deceptively simple excerpt. Simile, emotionally charged and visceral language like drawn his hand back in disgust, angry at the person who had left it there to rot, and sensory detail like feeling heat rise to my face. Then in the next paragraph, the narrative advances through fast-moving action. The young women characters are uncomfortable and seek to exit the situation. They're racially abused as they do so. Now, this announces a big development in the story. In the second half, the narrator introduces the notion that people are either freezers who don't defend themselves and are generally passive, or kickers who fight back and go for what they want. This seeds the denouement to come. So bear that in mind, the importance of seeding something. So it's subtle. People aren't necessarily going to consciously pick it up, but then at the end they go, that is how it all comes together. And so here the story comes to its poignant conclusion. There's a moment of possibility between the narrator and Bilal at the bus stop, but she fails to seize it, confirming her conviction that she's a freezer. So again, these are straightforward recommendations, but I'll highlight a common pitfall of imaginative writing. Clichés and tropes are hard to avoid because they come so easily and roll onto the page so readily. So beware of phrases that feel familiar. It's no big deal if you catch one slipping out. It happens to all of us at times, but try rewriting it in a fresher, more interesting way if you have any kind of suspicion that you might be writing a cliche. Try to avoid recycling well-worn characters, plot, dialogue, and imagery that you're familiar with from television and other texts you've read, and instead try to express your own views and experiences in your own way. Even when we write fiction, we're doing that. We're drawing on our own experience and memory and sensory data. So think about how you experience the world and draw that into your voice. As I mentioned earlier, when producing a piece of creative writing in a tight time frame, you need to scale down in terms of vision and plot. Think about how late night shopping explores the theme of racism by establishing a foundational situation. Young working people of colour experiencing racism and sharing friendship. The writer then shows the characters under pressure in a series of scenes that creates a layered short narrative. And again, some questions to guide your reading as a writer practice and links to the Abdu and other imaginative texts. So I just want to talk through some tips for writing under pressure. Wordiness is a really common issue in both discursive and imaginative writing. Try to write concisely. This is even more important given the time and word count constraints of exam conditions. So try to make each word count. Avoiding adverbs like actually and immediately that don't add value and tend to clutter prose is one of the easiest ways to keep your writing tight. But don't labour too much over every word and sentence. This is challenging for the perfectionists among us. Do a quick check of each sentence for syntax and grammar before moving on to the next. It's vital you get some writing on the page. And if you move at a decent pace, you'll have time to come back to edit and polish. Of course, it goes without saying, if you're writing by hand, you need to go a bit more slowly and really consider the sentences and try and make sure that each one is working well. But again, try not to get too bogged down into it, because it can really, stall if you do that. So when you're in an exam and once you receive the prompt, take a few moments to settle on an idea, but don't waste time trying to work it all through in your head and thinking that you have to know exactly where it's all headed before you can start writing. You just need enough information to start writing. Writing isn't transcribing a fully formed mental vision. The act of writing itself generates ideas. And writing doesn't just come from what we think, it comes from our feelings. So get cracking as soon as possible and write steadily and try to kind of outright that inner critic, especially if it's a really negative one. We'll talk about that now, actually. So we all have a critical eye, and that's really essential for good writing. It's what helps you pick up a cliche so that you know to rewrite it, or a bit of awkward syntax so you know to smooth that out. But a negative and unproductive critical voice that issues broad, general, sweeping statements like "you can't write" or "this is rubbish," it's not constructive or helpful. That's the one you want to park. If it kicks in, tell it, "I don't have time for you right now. I'm doing my best. So unless you have something useful and specific to contribute, let me get on with it," and keep writing. So include scenes in your stories, imaginative, but not too many, given your constraints. Even discursive, you'll see that if you look at the Greek text, there's still quite a lot of scenes in it. There's commentary and various sort of forays into history as well, and other explorations of the suburb, but there are still scenes. So work in scenes, but don't try and cram too many in, and pay some attention to your paragraphing and structure, considering, where to start the narrative and where to conclude. As you can't know what your prompt will be, but you want to work closely to the stimulus because integrating that well is going to get a good result, it's best not to go in with too prescriptive a plan. Instead, spend some time in advance thinking about what kinds of themes, issues, and experiences might feed well into discursive and imaginative writing. The best creative writing comes from the writer's keen interest in the territory they're exploring. So go in with a few ideas that you have some genuine interest in, or that you feel some personal connection to for each mode of writing, and go with the one that seems to be the best fit for the stimulus. If you feel anxious or panicky at any point during the exam, take some slow breaths into the belly and tell yourself to trust the process of writing. If you feel torn between ideas, don't dwell in indecisiveness. Pick the idea that intuitively feels like it has the most juice in it, or the one that you would rather read, and commit to it. And if you feel stuck, it might be fear. Tell yourself your best is good enough and start writing. 2 important points before I wind up. 1, creative writing, especially when you're on the clock, is about quality over quantity. And 2, short pieces of creative prose aren't mini novels. It's better to go with exploring a theme or a resonant series of encounters, drawing on literary techniques, than to try writing a saga or a plot-heavy story in under 1,000 words. And remember, creative writing is an artful skill, like playing the violin or dancing. You wouldn't expect to play violin or perform a ballet on cue without practicing and some trial and error, and the same holds for writing. So practice reading as a writer and writing using various techniques, and be gentle with yourself.
Thanks so much, Meera. That was fantastic. We might go to a bit of a Q&A. I can't see anything coming through just yet, so I might ask you both a few questions if you don't mind. My first one would be, what do you think some of the differences are in studying, say, English in high school during the HSC and then coming to University of Sydney and studying English or creative writing? What are some of the differences in how you're studying?
I'll jump in on that one. Thanks, Charlotte. I think that one of the biggest differences is the fact that at university level, it's incredibly open. You have a lot of freedom. It's not as controlled an environment in terms of how we teach creative writing as I believe the high school context is. And so students are exploring a range of texts, lectures by experienced writers every week, and doing draft work of their own choice. So there's just a really wide range. And of course, you know, we don't give exams in university creative writing. It's all by assessment. And usually the assessment tasks in a course are sort of structured to build on the drafting process, because in reality, working writers know that a lot of it's about drafting and redrafting, and so we focus on that in our courses.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Meera. Anything to add, Meg?
I think that's a great answer, and I know there's a lot of questions coming through in the chat. So
Yeah.
I'll just quickly say that, yes, a lot more choice. So if you're particularly interested in Australian literature or poetry, you can specialise in those subjects. But maybe we should move on to some of the questions, because there's quite a few
lots coming through. All right, I'll start with the first one. Thanks everyone for popping some in the chat. This is awesome. I'll start with the first one. I often receive feedback to be more precise or clarify with my writing, but I still don't know how to do this while actively writing. How can I improve this?
Okay, so we've got a bit of a kind of cliche in writing teaching, which is be as specific as possible. So when somebody uses a word like be more precise, they're probably trying to tell you that your writing's a little bit generalized, that there's a bit broad strokes. So there's something very powerful about specifics, you know, concrete details, sensory detail, specific little descriptions, and things that really, that's what really bring a world to life on the page, or an experience to life on the page. So try to, you know, it's easy to sort of think in general terms, especially when you're under pressure, but try to find that little specific detail and draw that in, and don't be afraid to be really you know, to be nuanced and to dig a bit deep, you know, try to push yourself a little bit beyond your comfort zone, perhaps.
Thanks, Meera. Okay, next question is, what is your best advice for maintaining structure during a critical written response?
So I think we always tell students don't have a pre-planned response, and I agree with that. You really are setting yourself up for a bit of a nightmare if you go in with a pre-planned response, but you can have a pre-planned structure. It's always really important to know that your introduction has to state a really clear thesis, and the thesis statement is your argument. And I think about the thesis as a kind of umbrella statement, and you'll break up your response into the kind of prongs of the umbrella. And the prongs of the umbrella are the breaking down that thesis into different elements that you're going to prove. So you make sure that each topic sentence of your body paragraph refers back to that thesis in some way, and that your summary sentence confirms this is me answering the but why question that I've explained. So always think about making sure that you're following that thesis statement, and every paragraph is contributing to that. The other thing that I say really quickly is that when you're doing textual analysis, think about it as an upside down triangle. Think about the big things about the text, about the form, about the overall characterization, and then go into scene analysis and elements of particular form. Narrow down as you go. That's kind of the two things that I would say in that regard.
Thanks, Meg. Thanks, Meera. Next question is, how would you recommend responding when there is a really specific stimulus that doesn't match what you've prepared?
Well, I think this is why we're both stressing don't go in with too prescriptive a preparation, because you really can't know what's going to be thrown at you. And from what I hear, the stimulus can be quite specific and convoluted. So you really, I don't think you're going to get a great result if you try to sort of go in with a prefab, too specifically prefabbed idea. So as I'm suggesting, I'll let Meg speak to her side of it, but as I'm suggesting, go in with some themes, issues, experiences that, you know, some ideas that can feed well in, but that are flexible enough to adapt well to specific stimuli, rather than going in with a really, you know, absolute set plan, dot point outline of what you're going to do that might not at all meet the prompt.
Thanks, Meera. And again, this is sort of, I guess, an extension of that. What are some tips that you can give for students to summarize and revise effectively for English prior to their exams?
So I remember I used to be a HSC teacher, and I remember that my students would talk about having post-it notes on their shower screen and trying to remember quotes that way. And I would always tell them, try not to clutter up too much of your brain trying to remember big chunks of text, because you know that's setting yourself up to fail. The key thing is to be able to point to elements of the text, you know, talking about a particular metaphor, talking about how a character is formed, talking about a text context, depending on the module that you're working on, and being able to highlight that with just little grabs of the text. You don't have to be writing out big chunks of the text in order to prove your point. So I would say the best way to sort of summarize for the exam is to have each of your texts there and to create however your mind works. So I like mind maps. Create a mind map where you're looking at big things to do with style, big to do with form. You're looking at elements of, you know, context, if that's part of the module, or, you know, to have index cards where you point to different scenes that you think are significant. It's really important to remember that you've got to know the text inside out. But you don't have to have a prefabricated argument, and you shouldn't have a prefabricated argument, and try to spend your time and your brain capacity on remembering those sorts of elements of the text rather than sort of chunks of quotes or, you know, whole essays, because our brains just aren't set up to remember that much text in that way.
That's great. Thank you, Meg. Another question coming through. For the craft of writing, what are some ways to prepare for responses that ask you to respond using your prescribed text?
I might let Meg take this, because having that teacher insight would probably be valuable, I expect.
I think Meera's presentation is actually really good for this. So Meera talked about writing as a reader. So the thing that I would recommend you do based on Meera's presentation is you already know those prescribed texts, which is great. So spend some time writing in response to them, you know, picking out different metaphors you can run with, or different themes or different elements of the text. So the exam could ask you to pick up on any of those. So the more practice that you can do, you know, with saying, okay, this text I'm going to run with writing a response to it in terms of continuing the story, or I'm going to use one of its extended metaphors to create a new story. That's the sort of thing you should be doing. So practice as many responses to those prescribed texts as you can do. That's what I would be recommending that you do.
Beautiful. Thanks, Meg. Another question. Do you have any tips on selecting quotes from the texts we've been studying at school? You were saying that being specific is a good way to go, but how do we make sure the quotes we select aren't too broad, but also not so specific that we can't adapt them to suit questions we're asked in the exam?
So that's a good question, and I can see that is tricky. Again, I would reiterate what I said about not trying to memorize whole chunks of text, but I would also look to things that can be used in multiple ways. So for instance, in the Gail Jones short story that I showed, novel that I showed you, something like trampoline heart, 2 words, easy to remember. There's lots of different ways that you could use that. You could use it to show joy. You could use it to show a sense of childhood. You could use it to, with something else to show that sense of entering into a new place. So try to look for things that are multi-purpose, that you can use in multiple ways, and always look for quotations that have those elements of style and form. And again, often you might not even need a big quotation. You can just point to something like the use of a line break, variation in sentence lengths. So those are good ones because they don't require you to remember a whole chunk of text.
Beautiful. Thank you, Meg. We might have 2 more questions. This is probably a bit of a summary of the entire webinar, but what makes a full mark response a full mark response? So how can you get maximum marks in your writing?
Oh, that's
a tough question.
That's a tricky one. And look, I just want to say, to kind of, normalize not getting 100% marks. It's, we rarely give 100%. It's just, even the most, experienced writers. I mean, even the things, if I think back about the things that I've published, the pieces I'm most proud of, that I just think, that really is like, that's a jewel in my crown. There's still 4 or 5 words I would change, or, a sentence I'd edit out. So, I think it's really difficult, right? I think it's really difficult, the business of grading and creative writing, because they're just at odds, really, because creative writing is, it's a hard thing to grade, and it's a hard thing to kind of go for grades. And that's why I'm trying to stress that if you can find things to write about that you actually care about, connect to, are interested in, that's actually a better bet than, I think, than going for, I'll do this because I think it'll be simple. Students sometimes, I think this will be easy. You don't know what's going to be easy until you're right in the midst of it, and then you're too far. You really don't know. So it's best to go with something you actually have some passion for. That tends to grade the best. And even if you don't get the grade that you want, you'll have had a more enjoyable process and probably have learned more, which is actually the point of these assessment tasks, is to learn. So I know that's not a fun answer, because you just want the kind of the kind of quick fix for how to get the top grade, and you may get a really great grade. But I just want to say, if you can take the stress, the first thing I say to my students every semester is, I have to grade you. There's no way around that. But if you can try to forget about that while you're writing, that's going to really do you favors, because really in the real world, writers aren't graded, they're read. And so you want to write to be read. That's the main thing.
Thanks so much.
I know it's a HSC, so I can't say grades don't matter. Meg?
Thanks, Meera. Anything you wanted to add, Meg, to that?
I mean, from the critical point of view, I know that you're after the full marks, and we all are. And I would say that really that comes down to the strength of your ability to answer that but why question. So your analysis. So again, it's not about being able to remember the most quotations. It's not about knowing fancy words like modality and onomatopoeia. It's about being able to say, this is what matters in this text, and this is what the meaning is. And especially if that meaning is unique to you, it's something that you've read into the text and you've seen yourself, and not something that we might find on e-notes. That particularly is where you get that strength of a response. But again, if I had the answer to how to produce a full mark question every time, I would be a millionaire, because I would have sold that idea off. So sorry, I don't.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Meg and Meera. Those were fantastic questions, everyone. Thank you so much for putting them in the Q&A. I hope we managed to get through most of them today. If anyone has any questions after today, feel free to send us an email. We've got an email address I'll put in the presentation for you shortly. But thank you very much, Meg and Meera. We also have a newsletter that we publish quite regularly, and that gives us an opportunity to get in touch with you and let you know about what's coming up for us within the high school space. So we run our Articulate webinars quite frequently. We also have programs that we run within Society and Culture and Aboriginal Studies. So within the evaluation, if you select yes to the question of would you like to be kept informed of University of Sydney news and events, we'll pop you on our mailing list for the newsletter so you're updated about what's coming up and what's going on that might be relevant to you. We've also got a few other Articulate webinars coming up. So if you're currently studying Spanish, PDHPE or modern history, there's a QR code down the bottom here. Feel free to click on that and sign up to register for one of the upcoming Articulate sessions. Similar to this, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions to our amazing presenters at the end as well. So anything that you want answered before your exams, feel free to come along to those as well. And as I mentioned, if you have any other questions after today, our high school engagement email address is here, fast.partnerships@sydney.edu.au. Feel free to reach out to us after today if you have any questions. And I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Dr. Meera Atkinson and Dr. Meg Brayshaw for joining us today and sharing all their amazing wisdom. I hope everyone found it really useful, and I know that you'll smash your upcoming HSC exams, and we're wishing you all the best. And a big thank you to Joyce, who's been working in the background answering all your questions and just done an amazing job. So thank you, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you again at one of our other Articulates, but wishing you all the best for your upcoming exams. Enjoy the rest of your evening.